In less than a week, the United States went from a distant observer to a central player in a global war. A single attack was enough to shatter the illusion of safety that separated the country from a conflict. And nothing, not even Christmas, escaped that transformation. Suddenly, lights went dark, cities thought in terms of targets, and families thought in terms of goodbyes. What had once been a season of celebration began to take on a different meaning, quieter, heavier, charged with uncertainty. While the nation was still in shock, decisions were already being made that would reshape the course of history. How did a traumatized country manage to hold on to Christmas in the middle of fear and mobilization? Why preserve traditions when the future feels so fragile? And how did a simple illuminated tree turn into a powerful symbol of war, alliance, and endurance? To understand how Christmas 1941 became more than just a holiday, and instead a defining historical moment, we need to go back to where it all began. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't just damage ships and airfields. It shattered the American sense of distance from the war. Until that Sunday morning, the conflict raging across Europe and Asia still felt, to many Americans, like something happening over there. Then, on December 7, 1941, that illusion collapsed in a matter of hours. In the wake of the assault, President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved fast to frame what had happened and what it meant. Standing before Congress, he called it a date which will live in infamy, casting the strike not as a random tragedy, but as a turning point that demanded a national response. The United States declared war on Japan almost immediately, and within days, the conflict widened again. On December 11th, Nazi Germany, Japan's ally, declared war on the United States, and America answered in kind. In less than a week, the country went from watching a world war to being fully inside it. The numbers from Pearl Harbor made that reality impossible to soften. The attack destroyed 188 aircraft, sank 4 battleships and a minesweeper, and left 13 other ships mangled into floating wreckage. The human toll was even more brutal. Almost 3,500 sailors and soldiers were dead or wounded. This wasn't a warning shot. It was a message that the war could reach Americans directly, and that no ocean was wide enough to guarantee safety. By the time Christmas approached, only 18 days after the attack, the atmosphere in Washington had changed visibly. The capital became a city preparing to endure. Neon signs were dimmed. Black hoods covered the glow from fireboxes. Outdoor Christmas lights were rare, in keeping with regulations against unnecessary illumination of any kind. The precautions weren't symbolic, they were practical, a sign that people were now thinking in terms of targets, vulnerability, and the possibility of further attacks. Government agencies were being relocated to make room for mobilization. A wartime posture wasn't being debated anymore. It was being built. At the same time, the machinery of alliance and strategy accelerated. Winston Churchill arrived in Washington on December 22nd, traveling with his chiefs of staff to coordinate plans for defeating the common enemy. He wanted immediate unity, especially over how to balance war in the Pacific with a war in Europe. Churchill feared American pride and anger could push the United States to focus mainly on Japan, while Nazi Germany continued its assault across Europe. The urgency was clear. If the Allies didn't coordinate strategy right away, the war could splinter into competing priorities. So while Americans were still processing shock, the world's most powerful leaders were already moving into the next phase, planning, negotiating, preparing. And that is what made Christmas 1941 feel so strange. The holiday arrived not as a relief, but as a deadline, looming at the end of a month where everything familiar had been rewritten. And as factories shifted, lights dimmed, and leaders mapped out a global war, Americans faced a haunting question. What would Christmas feel like when the future itself had become uncertain? While Washington adjusted to blackouts and strategy meetings, the real weight of December 1940 once settled inside American homes. This was where the war stopped being abstract. For families across the country, Christmas arrived carrying an unfamiliar tension, quiet, restrained, and heavy with unspoken fear. For many parents, this Christmas came with the growing certainty that it might be the last one spent together as a family. Sons who had gone to church, helped decorate trees, or sat around the dinner table were now thinking about enlistment papers, physical exams, and deployment. The possibility of separation, or worse, hung in the air, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. Christmas conversations were careful. Smiles were genuine, but fragile. Yet traditions endured. Trees were still brought into living rooms. Ornaments were still unpacked from boxes. Gifts were exchanged, though often simpler and fewer than in years past. Wartime restrictions discouraged unnecessary lighting, and outdoor decorations became rare. The glow of Christmas shifted inward, becoming something private rather than public. This wasn't stubborn nostalgia, it was psychological survival. In a month defined by shock and uncertainty, Christmas became an anchor. Familiar rituals offered structure when the future felt suddenly unstable. Families clung to the holiday not because they felt festive, but because it reminded them of who they were before the world changed so abruptly. For soldiers still at home, the holiday carried a bittersweet intensity. Christmas meals tasted different when you suspected the next one might be eaten in uniform, far from home, or not at all. Every tradition felt sharper, more meaningful, precisely because it might not be repeated anytime soon. Photographs were taken with unusual care. Moments lingered longer than usual. Inside these homes, a stark contrast took shape. Radios carried grim news, ships sunk, battles planned, alliances forged, while living rooms remained quiet, warm, and deliberately ordinary. That contrast was jarring. The global war pressed in from every direction. Yet Christmas insisted on existing anyway, contained within walls, families, and small acts of normalcy. In this sense, Christmas 1941 wasn't about joy. It was about reassurance, about reminding one another that life still had meaning beyond headlines and casualty numbers. The home became a refuge, not from knowledge of the war, but from being consumed by it. But while families struggled to keep Christmas alive behind closed doors, something larger was unfolding in public view. A moment designed not for comfort, but for unity. And it would take place at the very center of American power. In the days following Pearl Harbor, even the most basic traditions were suddenly questioned. Among them was the White House Christmas tree ceremony. With the nation still in shock, security fears rising, and war plans consuming Washington, many wondered whether it was appropriate, or even safe, to proceed. Christmas, after all, was supposed to be a time of peace, and peace felt painfully distant. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a deliberate choice. The ceremony would go on. This was not a decision driven by celebration, but by symbolism. Plans for the 1941 tree had been made before the attack, with Roosevelt intending to make the event more intimate and accessible. For the first time, the Christmas tree was placed on the White House grounds themselves, near the South Lawn fountain, instead of on the ellipse. It was meant to feel homey. After December 7th, that meaning changed entirely. On Christmas Eve, thousands of Americans arrived despite fear and uncertainty. An estimated 20,000 people passed through military inspection to attend. The presence of armed guards and security checkpoints was impossible to ignore. This was no longer a carefree holiday gathering. It was a nation standing together under watchful eyes, aware that the world had shifted. As evening fell, the lights of the White House glowed against the cold December air. On the south portico stood Roosevelt, and beside him, an unexpected but deeply symbolic figure, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Their shared presence sent a powerful message even before either man spoke. This was not just an American moment. It was an Allied one. The ceremony was broadcast by radio, reaching millions across the United States and far beyond its borders. In a world fractured by war, radio waves carried words meant to steady, not excite. Roosevelt addressed the question many Americans were asking themselves. How could they light Christmas trees in a world filled with fighting, suffering, and death? His answer reframed the holiday entirely. Christmas, he argued, was not weakened by war, it was defined by it. He spoke of dignity, brotherhood, and faith in human love, setting those values in direct contrast to the hatred and violence preached by America's enemies. Christmas became a moral statement, not a celebration of comfort, but a declaration of belief. The tree itself became a symbol rather than an ornament. Its lights were no longer about cheer. They represented endurance, light in darkness, continuity in chaos. It stood as a reminder that the nation had not abandoned its values, even as it prepared for enormous sacrifice. Churchill followed with words that echoed and expanded this message, focusing on children and the future they deserved. He urged listeners to give them one night of happiness before returning to the formidable tasks ahead. In that moment, Christmas became less about the present and more about what was being protected. The ceremony lasted just 35 minutes, but its meaning lingered far longer. The White House Christmas tree of 1941 was not a celebration, it was a statement. And it marked the moment when Christmas itself became part of the war effort. Winston Churchill's presence in Washington during Christmas 1941 was far more than ceremonial. He had crossed a submarine-infested Atlantic because the moment demanded more than speeches. It demanded alignment. The war had entered a new phase, and without immediate coordination between Britain and the United States, victory was far from guaranteed. Churchill arrived on December 22nd, exhausted from a perilous journey, but determined to act quickly. He brought with him his chiefs of staff and an urgent strategic concern. Now that America was at war, how would it fight? The fear in London was that anger over Pearl Harbor would pull American focus entirely toward Japan, leaving Nazi Germany free to continue its brutal campaign across Europe. Churchill believed delay or division could be catastrophic. Christmas, therefore, unfolded inside the White House alongside intense military planning. Churchill stayed for weeks, living under the same roof as President Roosevelt. Their days were filled with discussions that stretched late into the night. Conversations not just about battles and logistics, but about priorities, production, and the shape of the war to come. Out of these meetings came a crucial agreement, a Germany-first strategy. Even as the Pacific burned, defeating Hitler would take precedence. Yet, amid this pressure, Christmas traditions continued. Quietly, deliberately, gifts were distributed to White House staff. Church was attended together on Christmas morning. The symbolism was unmistakable. Alliance was being forged not only in conference rooms, but through shared rituals. Christmas became a space where political unity turned into personal trust. Churchill's Christmas Eve broadcast captured this balance perfectly. Speaking far from home, he emphasized not loss, but kinship. He spoke of shared language, shared faith, and shared ideals. This, he insisted, was not a foreign fireside. It was a familiar one. In a world locked in violent struggle, he urged adults to give children one night of happiness, shielding them briefly from fear before returning to the stern tasks ahead. But Churchill's message was not sentimental. It was moral. Sacrifice, he argued, was not only necessary, it was purposeful. The war was being fought so that future generations would not be robbed of freedom or dignity. Christmas, in this sense, became a reminder of what the alliance was defending. Behind the scenes, strategy never paused. Meetings resumed even on Christmas Day. Plans for Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific took shape. Christmas was not an escape from war, it was folded into it. By the time the holiday ended, something irreversible had formed. The Anglo-American alliance was no longer theoretical. It was personal, strategic, and bound by shared resolve. Christmas 1941 did not slow the war, but it strengthened the partnership that would help win it. Christmas 1941 did not arrive with celebration or relief. It arrived quietly, weighed down by uncertainty, grief, and the knowledge that the world had changed forever. Yet, in that stillness, something essential revealed itself. This was not a joyful Christmas, but it was a meaningful one. Across the United States, the holiday reflected a nation absorbing trauma while refusing to surrender its identity. Families gathered not because they felt safe, but because togetherness itself had become an act of resilience. Traditions were maintained not out of habit, but out of necessity. Christmas became a reminder of what was worth defending in a world suddenly defined by loss and danger. At the center of that moment stood leadership and alliance. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill did not offer false comfort. They acknowledged suffering, sacrifice, and the long road ahead. But they framed Christmas as something stronger than fear, a moral anchor. Beneath the lights of the White House tree, the holiday was transformed from a symbol of peace into a declaration of purpose. Light was not a denial of darkness. It was a response to it. The presence of Churchill beside Roosevelt turned a national ritual into an international statement. Christmas 1941 was no longer just an American experience. It marked the visible birth of an alliance that would shape the outcome of the war. Strategy meetings resumed even on Christmas Day, underscoring a powerful truth. The war did not pause, but neither did resolve. In hindsight, this Christmas stands apart from all others. It was not defined by abundance or joy, but by clarity. Americans understood that the months and years ahead would demand endurance, sacrifice, and unity on an unprecedented scale. Christmas did not soften that reality. It prepared the nation to face it. This was the quiet moment before the long march. The pause before total mobilization. Christmas 1941 set the emotional tone for the war that followed, not with celebration, but with conviction. A nation in shock, but not broken. A people mourning, but not retreating. In a world at war, Christmas became a promise that even in darkness, purpose would endure, and that the values being defended were worth every sacrifice to come.